Last week we started a series called OmniGod, and what we're essentially doing is looking at the different attributes of God and what they have to do with you. For instance, last week we talked about the fact that God is omniscient, meaning he's all-knowing. He knows everything. And when I say everything, he knows everything. He knows what you were thinking. He knows the thoughts that have been going through your mind. He knows your motives, even when you don't know what your motives really were. He knows. And a little bit of the fact of, isn't that kind of scary? Doesn't that make you a little bit uncomfortable? And yet last week we talked about the fact that God knowing everything is actually essential for us. It is critical for us that God know every single detail about your life, because when you've got garbage in your life and it's hidden and it's buried down deep, you can never be free from it. It'll eat away at you like a cancer. It'll disrupt your life. It'll distort your relationships. It'll distort your perspective. It'll distort everything. And it'll heap on you shame and guilt. And you may not feel it on the surface, but it's down there. And God wants you to be free. But the only way you can be free is stuff is taken out, exposed in some way, and removed. Now, no one can set you free. Not even you can set you free, because you don't even know all this stuff in your life. But if God knows everything, He can look at every yucky, filthy thing in your life. He can see it. He can see it and says, I see what's going on in your life. I see it, and I love you anyways. And I want to set you free from the garbage in your life. I want to set you free to be everything I create you to be. And we need a God who sees everything, who can set us free in that way. And so omniscience is incredibly important. This week, we're moving on to the concept of omnipresence, the idea that God is actually everywhere at once. Now, I want you to think through. Have there been times in your life when you have questioned, is God here? Or where was God when? And your mind might immediately go back to some crises in your life, some painful situation, some time when something was going on and you just didn't understand the big picture, and you just felt, where is God now? Why isn't God here? Why isn't God doing something about it? And really what we're questioning is God present? And is He able to do something about what's going on here? And the fact that I don't see Him doing anything, in my mind, would seem to imply God is not omnipresent. God is absent from my life. He is not here. Or He would do something. And so we struggle with the omnipresence of God. Sometimes in that way. Sometimes I struggle with the omnipresence of God. Or I evidence the fact that I don't really believe it by the things I choose to do. Have you ever done something wrong and you knew it was wrong, but nobody else knew that you did it? It was hidden. Just you did it. Just you by yourself. And at that time you're thinking, even God doesn't really know what I'm doing. That's sort of hidden from God. And I may not even be thinking that way, but practically how I live, I sometimes choose to live in a way that would suggest God is not present in my life. You know what? If we live that way long enough, we eventually start to question, is God even out there? Does God even exist? Is there a God that I can count on? A God I can turn to? We've got a little drama here, and this drama sort of draws out the fact that, sometimes we're taught stuff as when we're kids, but maybe as we grow on, we start to question, is God really there? Why don't you watch this with us? There's a mute button. People love the mute button. There's a passage in Scripture that essentially takes what Patrick just sang and brings it to life. And it's a song too, actually. We started reading it last week, and we're going to continue it on. It's from Psalm 139, verses 7 to 12. And this is where David, he writes a psalm, and he says, "Where can I go from your spirit? Where can I flee from your presence?" Have you ever been like that? You sometimes just want to run away from God, get away from him, not be seen by him, not be accountable to him. It says, "If I go up to the heavens, you're there. If I make my bed in the depths, you're there. If I rise on the wings of the dawn, if I settle on the far side of the sea, even there your hand will guide me, your right hand will hold me fast. If I say, hey, surely the darkness will hide me, and the light become night around me, even the darkness will not be dark to you. The night will shine like the day, for darkness, it's as light to you." So here's the question. Is God the ultimate stalker? He's watching you. He's following you. He's tracking you down, and you just can't get away from him. And the thing is, God's not chasing after you. Wherever you go, he's already there, waiting for you. See, it's a difference. He's not spying on you. He's in every location you want to go. He's there ahead of you. Now, this concept of omniscience and this omnipresence, they're sort of inseparable, aren't they? I mean, God's all-knowing, partly because he's everywhere all at once. And God's everywhere at once, and so he knows all these things and what's going on in every single location. The difference between omnipresence and omniscience is that omniscience is just understanding what's going on. Omnipresence is, I'm there. You see, God could be omniscient and just stay up in heaven, distantly watching from heaven, and just know everything. And sometimes that's how we tend to view God. He's a distant God who's way up there somewhere. Meanwhile, I'm down here. But the concept of the omnipresence of God brings God a lot closer, a lot more intimate, because he's just not up there. He's with you wherever you go. And wherever you're trying to get to, he's there waiting for you. He's with you as you go there. He's there waiting for you. And I guess the question is that a good thing or is that a negative thing? What do you think? When I tell you God is everywhere and there's no place you can go and he won't be there standing at your side, does that create a sense of comfort or a sense of discomfort for you? And that's something we want to grapple through a little bit. I do want to put a sideline note in here that sometimes we view people as sometimes omnipresent and omniscient. Have you ever done that? Have you ever had a loved one die and you talk to them? Have you ever prayed to someone who's gone off to heaven? And in our minds, what are we ultimately saying about that person? We're saying, if that person can hear me from wherever I'm at, they must be both omniscient and omnipresent. But I got to let you know, that's not true. That's not the case. That's not good theology. God is the only one who's omniscient. God is the only one who's omnipresent. Just because I die and go to heaven does not mean I suddenly become a demigod. Does not suddenly mean that I know everything. Just because if I die today and I go to heaven does not mean I know everything that's going around the world. And if someone from anywhere in the world talks to me, can I hear all that? Can I suddenly have that God capacity to know all things and to hear all things and to see everything that's going on in every area? No, that's not true. That's not great theology. Now, some of you have experienced this, maybe with talking to the dead from your past and stuff like that. That's stuff you might want to come and talk to us about. But to explore a little bit more deeply. But I do want you to know that when you die, you do not become omniscient. You do not become omnipresent. You do not suddenly hear everything that someone says on the earth. And the Bible actually gives us stories and illustrations of that. And we can actually go back to the Bible to get a better theological grasp on that. That's a side note. What I want to get into here is this concept of the omnipresence. Is that a good thing or a bad thing? And there are definitely a lot of people in the Bible who thought it was a bad thing. the fact that God was everywhere. They had this concept in the cult religions in the Old Testament, and even sometimes moving into the New Testament, a concept of the gods as being territorial gods. If I'm the God of this nation, my God has powers over this nation and is got strengths in this nation. Like the God of the mountains, well, he's going to be really strong in protecting people in the mountains. Well, the God of the seas is going to be with the sailors on the seas. And the God of the valleys is going to give his people victory when they're fighting in the valleys. And this concept that gods, and there are many gods in their concept, that their gods had specific strengths, and therefore they camped out in those areas of specific strength. As long as you're there with them, you're under the protection of that God. So that even crept into Israel belief at some points in time, where they started viewing God as territorial. Sure, the God of Israel is God of Israel, but is he beyond the borders of Israel? And there was this one guy, a prophet by the name of Jonah, and God asked him to go and send news of judgment to this other nation, which is kind of interesting, cross borders into another nation of Assyria, and to bring a message of judgment to that nation, saying, in 40 days, we're going to destroy you. Jonah said, no way. I'm not going to take that message to Nineveh, because God, I've caught on to a few things of what you do. You always give people a little bit of a warning. But implied in that warning that there's going to be judgment in 40 days is an opportunity for repentance and salvation. And Jonah hated the Ninevites. The Ninevites were incredibly oppressive. They are cruel, they are vicious. They would keep coming in and attacking the towns, the border towns of Israel, and stealing their crops and taking some Israelites off as captives and as slaves. Jonah hated Nineveh. He wanted them to get full wrath, full judgment. And there was no chance he was going to go to Nineveh and preach the message of judgment. So, what's he do? He says, I'm going to run away. Hops on board a ship. He starts sailing across the Mediterranean from Israel, headed probably over to the coast of Spain. He's going to get as far away in the known world as he can possibly get from the God of Israel. Well, Jonah discovers in that journey that God is not just the God of Israel. He's also the God of the seas, the God of the mountains, the God of foreign nations, the God of all people. And what's interesting is in his journey where God's trying to get his attention, everyone else pays attention to God. The sailors who were pagan, cultic follower sailors, they turn their attention towards God. They seek God. They suddenly discover God is the true God over all things. Jonah, who's still supposedly the prophet of God, is the one still running away from God. Well, you can read the rest of that story. Most of you know it. What I'm simply saying is, sometimes we want to run from God. Sometimes I want to do what I want to do, and I'm going to run from God in my mind because I don't want to hear what he has to say. And so if I veer off and I go over here, I'm thinking, hey, God's not going to be over here. But what I discover is that God's already there before me. He's already there. And he wants my attention. So as we think about this concept of the omnipresence of God, if it's a positive, in what way can it be a positive for you in your life and this week? How can the reality that God is with you and will be wherever you go, how is that a positive for this week? And how can that radically change how you choose to live and approach life this week? And there's two main things I just want to suggest to you, and I want you to consider. And the first one is that the omnipresence of God, if I believe it, if I embrace it, and if I accept it and live by it, what it's going to do, it potentially has the ability then to act on me and give me courage. Give me strength to do things that I could not have done had I thought I was just on my own, doing things in my own strength, in my own ability. Let me give you an example. There is a story that comes from 2 Kings chapter 6, where there's another prophet by the name of Elisha. And Elisha isn't like Jonah. Elisha is very God-fearing and staying true to the message of God. There's another nation by the name of Aram. And the king of Aram, what he would do is he would plot how he would come in, and sort of like the Assyrians, he would come in and sort of attack the Israelites. He wanted to defeat the Israelites, steal their crops, steal their people, steal their wealth, all that sort of thing. But what happened, because God is everywhere and God knows everything, God knew all of the king of Aram's strategies to attack Israel. He knew it all. And what God would do, he would convey these plans to Elisha. Elisha would send a message to the king of Israel saying, hey, here's what the king of Aram's going to do. He's going to set up his camp over here, and he's going to sort of attack from this city over here, and he's going to go through this valley here. He's going to do this. And every single time, God would send the message through Elijah to the king of Israel saying, here's what the king of Aram's going to do. As a result, Israel could then mount their defenses and prevent the attack from happening. And the king of Aram's getting so frustrated, he's saying, what is going on here? Who in our inner council is a traitor and who's sending the message and the plans off to the king of Israel? And finally the guys, his council is saying, well, it's no one on our team. What I got to let you know what's going on is we've discovered that God's sending this message onto the prophet Elisha. And Elisha is informing the king of Israel what's going on. Now, I would be thinking that, okay, king of Aram, if there is a God who knows your inner thoughts and all your plans and everything, and he's conveying that to another king, do you really want to go up against this? But the king of Aram is so upset, angry, he puts together this army. He finds out where Elisha is in this little town. He sends the army, and when Elisha's the servant of Elisha, gets up in the morning and he looks out his window, he sees an army surrounding the town. And he's terrified. Well, it says in 2 Kings chapter 6, verse 15, it says, when the servant of the man of God got up and went out early that next morning, an army with horses and chariots had surrounded the city. Oh, my Lord, what shall we do? The servant asked. Don't be afraid, the prophet Elisha answered. Those who are with us are more than those who are with them. And the servant's got to be looking at Elijah saying, this small little town's more than those guys out there? There's not a chance in the world that we, as a little town, could take on this entire army of the king of Aram. There's not a chance. We are going to be destroyed. And Elisha says, you don't get it. You don't understand. You're not seeing the big picture. So listen to what it says. Elisha prayed, O Lord, open his eyes so he may see. Then the Lord opened the servant's eyes, and he looked, and he saw the hills full of horses and chariots of fire all around Elisha. You see, when you understand that God is present, that changes everything, doesn't it? See, if you don't know that God is present, suddenly the challenges in life become pretty insurmountable. How in the world can I deal with this? How can I deal with this struggle? How do I get over this problem? How do I deal with this tension? I just don't see a way to deal with life. And as a result, I start getting stressed. I'll go into depression. And it's going to start hindering my life in so many ways. Simply because I do not know that God is present. Now, how do you think the servant's perspective radically shifted in the few moments when God opened his eyes and he saw this angelic army surrounding them? When he saw that the angelic army with all its power and its presence was far greater than Aram's army. Do you think his perspective changed? Do you think his courage raised a little bit? Think he had a better hope in life? You see, all it takes is knowing that God is present, and it changes everything. If you don't think God is present, and that God's walking with you, and that God cares about you, you're going to be living a life that lacks joy, definitely lacks peace. It's going to be one struggle after struggle after struggle after struggle. And I got to let you know that that's not what God created you for. He wants you to know he's there, and he wants to walk with you in victory. Listen to what a couple of these verses with regard to God's presence and how it can strengthen us as far as giving us courage. Matthew 28, a passage, if any of you have been coming to LifeBridge, you should have memorized by now. It's the Great Commission. Therefore, go and make disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father, the Son, the Holy Spirit, teaching them to obey everything I've commanded you. And surely I am with you always to the very end of the age. And this is Jesus saying, guys, I'm with you. And my presence with you should give you such a sense of who I am and what we want to accomplish and what you can do if I am with you. And said, the number one thing I want you to do is I want you to go into this world and represent me. I want you to tell other people about me. Now, you see, I get a little nervous about doing that. I'm a little insecure. I'm a little bit fearful. What if I go in and talk to someone and they don't accept me, they don't respect me, they reject me, and all that sort of stuff packaged in there? And then I think, would I have those same tensions of talking to people about Jesus if Jesus was right there beside me? If he physically came and said, Rob, you can do this. I'm going to be right with you. I'm going to even give you the words to say. I'm going to have my arm on your shoulder. I'm going to support you. Just represent me. Make me proud of you and how you... You know, I think I'd be a little bit more courageous in how I talk to other people about God. I might not hold back as much. I might actually start caring about other people's eternal destinies more than just my own need for acceptance. You see, the presence of God, if I truly believe it, it'll free me to build into the lives of other people. Listen to what it says in Joshua 1:9. This is a scenario where Moses has just died. He's been leading the Israelites for 40 years through a wilderness, and now he's bringing them to the land that was promised to them. And Moses has just died before they cross the river into this land. And there's over 1 million people, and Joshua is now the newly appointed leader. And he knows what this group is like. He knows how frustrating they can be. He knows all the bickering, he knows all the complaining, the grumbling, and the lack of faith, and he's experienced it for the past 40 years. And now that's all being placed on his shoulders. And now, not only that, but they're now venturing into a land that God's promising them, but there are enemies in that land that want to destroy them. There's fortresses, there's giants, there's all this stuff. And Joshua's a little bit daunted by this task. And so what does God come? He says, 3 times in chapter 1 of Joshua, he says, be strong and courageous. And ultimately that's rooted in the fact of, because I am with you. It says, have I not commanded you, be strong and courageous. Do not be terrified, do not be discouraged, for the Lord your God will be with you wherever you go. And there's nothing God cannot do. You see, a lot of times I hold back from taking steps of faith because I'm not convinced I'll be okay on the other side of the step. I fear failure. I fear my inadequacies will be really evident, and people won't value, they won't respect me. I won't respect me. So it's better just to play it safe. But when you understand that God is with you, and he's calling you into a mission, he's calling you to a task, then that suddenly frees you to do things you never dreamt you could do. And what I get so excited about here at LifeBridge, as I see you guys grow in your walk with God, I see you take that step of faith and embrace a ministry you would have been terrified to have done. For these guys that are getting up here and preaching, to have never preached before, that we're doing this training with, and they're embracing the fear and conquering the fear, to me that's exciting. For seeing you guys saying, I will do that ministry even though it scares the living daylights out of me, but I'm going to do it because God is with me, and I sense that he's calling me to that task. Unless I had a sense of the presence of God, there's no way Julie and I would have ever left Winnipeg to come here to start a church with no financial backing, no people other than Dave and Shelley as a team support. We would never have done it. The reason we came to do this was because of a sense of the presence of God. Gordon and Anna would not venture off to Honduras next spring unless they had a conviction about the presence of God, that God's not just here, but God's also going to be waiting for them there. You see, the presence of God gives you courage to do stuff you would never have done on your own and in your own strength. And I got to let you know that if you do not embrace the presence of God in your life, you're going to be trapped in inadequacy. You're going to be trapped in an unfulfilled life that never reaches the potential God created it to be, because he created you to do stuff with him, and he's going to call you to the greater stuff. But if you keep God out of the picture, fear is going to rule your life. Fear is going to trap you in keeping the idea of just playing it safe. You will not venture out into the areas that are uncontrollable, because if something's uncontrollable, well, that's unacceptable. But God can say, no, you can't step out into areas where you're not in control, because I am in control. And I am present. And I'm with you. In Genesis 48:21, Jacob, whose name was also Israel, from which the Israel nation gets its name, it says, then Israel said to Joseph, his son, I'm about to die, but God will be with you. See, the incredible thing about the presence of God is, one, it frees me to die. Does that sound kind of morbid? Is that kind of strange? You see, if you were to ask me, Rob, do you fear death? I'd say, I don't really fear death per se. In fact, sometimes I just long to die and go and be in heaven where everything's just made right. Let's get that going. But see, my fear would be, what about my kids? What about my family? What about LifeBridge? What about, and suddenly my fears of who's going to care for my family and these other types of things start to rule. But see, if I understand that God is going to be present even with them, suddenly I don't have to have those fears. I don't have to worry about what happens to my family. If God chooses to take me home because that's his good and perfect timing, great. My family is okay. Why? Because God is with them. And that is also a comfort. You know, if I was on my deathbed and I was dying, and my family was a bit concerned, that they're wondering, gee, what's going to happen? Dad's gone. How are we going to be provided for? What's, all the typical fears. I would want to be able to say to them, saying, you know what? Don't be afraid. God's with you. He's going to take care of you. As long as you keep seeking him first and you don't veer off in your own path, God will always take care of you. If you choose to veer away from God, I'd also want to put this disclaimer to my kids. If you choose to veer away from God and choose your own path, then God's saying, my protection's not there for you. All the things I have for you are not there for you. All the stuff I have in store for you are over here. Come back. Now, if you find yourself have wandered away and get there, God's always, always, always willing to be with you there and bring you back to where he wants you to be. See, that's the neat thing about God being omnipresent is you might dig the deepest pit you could possibly dig for your life, and God will be at the bottom of the pit. And at any point in time that you choose to turn your life back on track with God, he's saying, I'm there for you. And I'll walk with you. And I'll help you. I'm present. It says in Deuteronomy 31, verse 8, the Lord himself goes before you and will be with you. He will never leave you nor forsake you. Do not be afraid. Do not be discouraged. You are never alone. And you know what? There have been times in my life I've struggled with loneliness. There have been times in my life where I've just felt there is no one there. But God's taught me a lot through the years. And one of the things is, I'm never alone. And I can honestly say, I've never really felt alone. Don't some of you wish you could say that? I've never really felt alone. Not because there's always been people who have been supportive and stuff. No, people come, people go. People aren't always supportive. People aren't always encouraging. Sometimes relationally with people, I've sometimes felt maybe distant or alone in my life. But I've never completely felt alone because I've chosen to embrace the presence of God. And his presence is there. And that's what God wants to say. He wants to say to you, wherever you're at in life, I'm there with you. You might feel distant. You might feel like you're struggling. You might feel like but that's because you're doing it all on your own and you're not including me in the picture. And God's saying, if you would just understand my presence, I will give you strength. I will give you courage. And I will raise you up to do stuff that you never thought you could do. I will help you walk away from fear. So that fear no longer manipulates and distorts your life and hinders you from being what I create you to be. God will say, I will give you courage to be everything I create you to be. And what a rockin' journey that will be. The last thing I do want to say to you about what the presence of God can do in your life if you choose to embrace it is that God can give you the strength to act righteously. Let me give you another story. And this is a story that most of you are going to be familiar with. This Joseph that Jacob was talking to earlier, saying, I'm about to die, but God will be with you. Earlier on in Joseph's life, Joseph was taken by his brothers, his 11 brothers, or 10 brothers, I guess, at that time. He was taken by his brothers, and he was beaten. He was stripped of his clothes, and they were going to kill him. You think your family's dysfunctional. So Joseph now, though, instead of them killing him, they decide, well, why would we kill him when we can actually make some money off him? And so they throw him in a pit. And Joseph's waiting in a pit until this caravan comes along, and they decide to sell Joseph to this caravan as a slave. So this caravan buys Joseph and takes Joseph off to Egypt. And Joseph is now a slave in Egypt, in a country where he doesn't know the language, he doesn't know the culture, he's miles and miles and miles and miles and miles away from home. Different religion. And you got to understand that Joseph himself has no formal religion. He has a belief in God and a relationship with God, but there's no church concept that exists at this point in Israel's history. There is no temple, there is no tabernacle, there's no altars, there's no choirs, there's nothing. All there are stories that have been passed down from daddy and great-granddaddy about their experiences with God. Now, Joseph has had a few weird dreams, sort of prophetic dreams, but those are the dreams that got him into trouble in the first place. So all he has is stories that's been passed down about God's appearances to his father and his grandfather and so on. But Joseph himself has no real sense or understanding about God and who he is, but other than this belief in this relationship. And especially now off in a distant land, you would think, well, where's God now? If anyone would think this is the perfect time to chuck any perspective of God, it would be now. God's allowed him to be beaten and betrayed by his brother, sold into slavery, shipped off to Egypt, and is now a slave in Egypt. Yeah, where are you, God? Now, you might not have had it to quite the same extreme extent as Joseph, but I can guarantee you that a good portion of you have had moments in your life where you've questioned, where is God? What's interesting about Joseph is he's never questioned the presence of God. And because he believed in the presence of God, it started to act on him in a way that gave him strength and courage and to live righteously in whatever he did. And as a result, even in the worst of circumstances, because Joseph did things God's way, God kept raising him up, 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 up. Joseph would get beaten down again, but then God would raise him up, 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 and up. There's this one scenario where Joseph is now sort of the head guy in Potiphar's house. Potiphar was a ruling person in Egypt, and he found that Joseph was such a good servant that he just left everything in Joseph's hands. And Potiphar would just go off and do his business, whatever. The only problem here was that Potiphar had this wife, an attractive wife, who was home alone a lot. And she looked at Joseph saying, hey, Joseph's pretty good looking. Potiphar's away. Maybe Joseph and I can have a little bit of a thing going on here behind the scenes. No one would know. No one would know. So the secret, it would just be an affair between the two of them. You know, that's pretty appealing. Joseph, Potiphar's wife, what's to stop that? Well, listen to what he says here. Listen to what it says in verse 6 of Genesis 39. So he left in Joseph's care, everything he had, that's Potiphar. With Joseph in charge, he did not concern himself with anything except the food he ate. Man, wouldn't that be cool? Now, Joseph was well-built and handsome, well, like me. And after a while, his master's wife took notice of Joseph and said, "Come to bed with me." But he refused. "With me in charge," he told her, "my master does not concern himself with anything in the house. Everything he owns, he has entrusted to my care. No one is greater in this house than I am. My master has withheld nothing from me except you, because you are his wife." But then listen to this statement. "How then could I do such a wicked thing and sin against God?" And though she spoke to Joseph day after day, he refused to go to bed with her or even be with her. He starts setting boundaries on the relationship. And what's interesting here is Joseph's far away from family. In many ways, people could feel that he's been abandoned by God. And yet Joseph believes in the presence of God in his life. And that presence of God gives him the strength and the courage to act righteously no matter what circumstances he finds himself in. He didn't start justifying wrong behavior. He didn't start arguing. He didn't feel that he had to cheat. He didn't have to feel that he's had to get his own back. And since he was sold as a slave, he didn't feel he had to even fight that. He just had to trust the presence of God in his life. And that gave him the courage to act respectfully and nobly and lovingly towards his slave master. Wouldn't you think if you had a slave master, if you could just do anything to him to get even? But Joseph, because God's presence in his life, has the courage to do the right thing each step of the way. You know, it's kind of a built-in accountability, isn't it? Parents, you sometimes notice that if your kids are just off in a room by themselves, they might start squalling, but if you come in, suddenly they'll maybe stop doing what they were doing if they knew it was wrong. Or do you sometimes find that youth in the classroom, if the teacher steps out, Shelley, I don't know if you discover this, but that you step out of the classroom, does chaos sort of erupt? But as soon as the teacher steps back in, suddenly order is reestablished. There's accountability. Do you even discover that in your own life? There's sometimes you might do something, but as soon as someone else comes along, you change your behavior because now there's sort of someone to observe you and accountability. Do you sometimes find that even when you walk into church, you change how you relate? You could have been yelling a blue streak in the car at your kids. Suddenly you walk in church, "Hi, good morning." You know, there's built-in accountability. It's great. Don't you just wish you had that all the time? You see, there's a benefit about understanding that God's presence is with me. Not from a fearful, oh, God's going to keep judging everything I do, but in the sense of God's presence gives me the strength and the courage to act the way I should. And to be honest, the way I'd really like to be. See, I'd like to be a righteous person. I like to do things right all the time. But my sin nature wants to distort that. And the presence of God calls me back. And it's not, again, about a negative accountability, but when I understand the presence of God, it instills in me a desire to be with Him. Don't you think it's going to be so cool on the new earth that God creates to be able to walk beside Jesus and just see all the things He does, all the things He has to say? Isn't there just a sense of His presence that's going to create in you a deeper passion to be with Him? Isn't there something about the presence of God that would instill in you, if you understood God was present there, that it would just create in you a deeper appreciation and love and a desire to be with Him, a desire to be like Him? And some of you have had these experiences in your life. Times where you've had sort of a very special awareness of the presence of God, and it's blown you over, it's hit you like a 2x4 across the head, and it's just created in you not a sense of wanting to run away from God, but a desire to run even closer to God. Some of you had this relational experience. And you know, God sometimes gives those at different points in our life. But when you do have those relational times with God, what it creates in you is just a deeper longing to be with God. And His presence is not a negative. It's the hope of life. So, I guess the challenge for us is, how do we go about and practice the presence of God this week? As you leave here this morning, how are you going to develop in your understanding, in your mind, a sense of the presence of God in such a way that it'll give you greater courage to represent him this week. Greater courage to step out in faith and do things you would never have done before. How can you relate to the presence of God in such a way that it's going to make you want to live righteously and do right stuff instead of the stuff that messes up your life and the lives of other people? How can we remember that? Well, I have no idea. Let me throw a few suggestions that maybe you can try. Number one, why don't you try going 10 minutes without praying? You know, remember that one quote one guy says, I never pray for more than 10 minutes, but I never go 10 minutes without praying? And what I mean by that is, why don't you just include God in your conversation wherever you go? Maybe it doesn't always have to be out loud. People might just think you're weird. But just even in your thoughts, just saying, hey, God, as I'm just walking, hey, thanks for this day. Thanks for the sun. Thanks for, God, I love fall. This is so cool. God, and just as you go through life, why don't you just act as though God is physically there beside you and just talk to him? See, my guess is if Jesus was physically beside you as you went through your day, you'd probably talk to him about everything that you're experiencing as you go through it. You wouldn't reserve it for just one sort of 10-minute prayer at the end of the day or at meal times. You would probably dialogue with God constantly through your day as you go to work, as you're talking with others. You would just keep a conversation going. Jesus, hey, Jesus, what do you think I should do here? I got to make this sort of decision. God, Jesus, I got to deal with this really incredibly annoying person at work. How would you handle that? God, I got to come home and I got to deal with my kids. How would you handle that? You see, if we can just practice this presence of God, it's going to give us the strength to do what we should do and the desire to respond in right ways. One other way that you might want to do this, you might take a verse, a very small verse, and just saying, I'm going to try and memorize a verse throughout the day. And just keep that verse running through your head, because I can guarantee you, if you keep a scripture verse running through your head, you're going to be a little bit more God-tuned. It might be even simply the verse, my peace I leave with you, Jesus says. And just saying, my peace I leave with you. Okay, I think I should be able to memorize that one. My peace I leave with you. And Jesus, what do you mean by that? Jesus, what type of peace do you have? And if you give me your peace, what will that mean in my life? If I actually believe it and I embrace it, do you think if I'm just running over that verse in my head, that might actually affect my life? One thing we've talked about before is those of you who have these incredibly annoying digital watches that beeps on the hour, set it to beep on the hour. The beep goes off, check, hey, where's God? Like, who's in control of my life right now? When that beep goes off, am I in control of my life, or is God running my life? And what you'll find is that beep occurs at the most annoying times. That beep will occur right at a point when you're starting to veer off in your own direction, and God wants to call you back. You know, eventually you'll become immune to the beep, but for the first probably couple of weeks, you'll hear it, you'll respond. Maybe what you need to simply do is take a little pack of sticky notes and just plaster them everywhere. God's here, God's here, God's here, God's here, God's here. And just let the reminder that God's here affect how you relate. That might even affect how your coworkers relate to you. They say, God's here, God's here. So, could be interesting. All I'm simply saying is find practical ways to remember. Because, guys, if you're anything like me, I forget that God's right here with me right now. And as a result, I go off and I do things I should not do. I think things I should not think. And I hold back in fear in ways when I should be stepping out in courage. Just to wrap up, it says, find rest in Psalm 62. Find rest, O my soul, in God alone. My hope comes from him. He alone is my rock and my salvation. He is my fortress. I will not be shaken. My salvation and my honor depend on God. He is my mighty rock, my refuge. And what I was thinking is, maybe I just need something to remind me that God's my rock and that he's present and I can ground my life in him. And so what I did was I took some rocks here. And I'm going to invite you, if you find this beneficial, to come up and grab a rock. Most of these rocks, by the way, I think these are probably all from Amethyst Cove. To get to Amethyst Cove, it's about a half-hour hike, about a 400-foot descent, and then a 3-kilometer walk down a beach. I know that sounds sadistic. For us, it's fun. We pick up rocks along the way, and then we just come back and tumble them, because what we discover is when we tumble them, there's incredible beauty that gets drawn out of the rocks. I confess I've kept the best ones for me. But my reject leftover ones, I'm making available to you. But they're still cool. Some of you may find it beneficial to have something that you're going to carry in your pocket, or something that you're going to put on your desk, just something that's weird, just to cause you to remember. Why do I have a rock in my pocket? Oh, because the rock is always with me wherever I go. Maybe it's going to be on your desk just as a rock just sitting there, and no one else is necessarily going to know what it means, but you look at it and saying, God is my rock and he is present. He's solid, he's strong. I can be courageous. I can do things I never thought I could do, and I'm going to live in a way that represents his loving character. And I'm going to represent him wherever I go. You know, if you find it beneficial to have one of these little rocks to remind you of the presence of God, if that's something that you think would work for you, what I'm going to invite you to do is when we sing our closing song, I'm going to invite you can just come on up, you can grab a rock. Don't spend half an hour sorting through, just trying to find the best one. But do what you want. Yeah, best ones are at my house. But if it's helpful to you, take a rock. If God's prompting you in some way, you may want to take your connection card. You may want to write something as an action step that you think, you know what, in light of what Rob's saying here today, I need to do this week. In which case, you may want to write that action step on your connection card, and we'll send that as an email reminder out to you midweek, just so that you will remember to do what God placed on your heart to do. If there's something that God's speaking to you and you want to communicate that back to us, if something really spoke to you, you may want to write that on your connection card too. If you've got something you want us to pray for, and maybe there's some issue in your life you'd like our prayer team praying for it, then put that on the connection card. Your connection cards can just stay on the seats, or if you've written something confidential, you may want to put in the basket. Dave Ty will be standing at the back, Miriam Ty as well, with baskets. You can just put that connection card in the basket. They'll take care of that for you. Why don't I pray as the worship team comes? Father, I have to confess, I sometimes live as an atheist. I live as if you don't exist. I do things as if you are not present. I think things as if you're not present. In many practical ways, Father, I confess, I live more like an atheist than I do as your child. And I don't want that to be the case. I don't want that to be the case for anyone in this room. Father, I'm going to ask, would you remind us, would your Spirit just prompt our thinking to remember you this week and to see if that makes a change in our lives? Would you constantly call us back to reflect on the fact that you are present, you are there, you are with us. You are our rock, you are our fortress, you are our strength. Our honor comes from you. Father, would you help us to remember that week, and would it radically change how we approach this coming week? And Lord, I just pray that as a result, we would be strengthened and that your church would grow. I pray this in Jesus' name.